Hello and welcome to week 4 in our developmental psych class corresponding to chapter 4. Again, conveniently, so as we launch right in today's content, we have lots of interesting things going on. We're talking about early childhood. We have a whole degree program on early childhood here at KVCC. There is fascinating, amazingly cool things that are happening. The building blocks of cognition, the building blocks of social learning, the building blocks of perspective taking, all of these happening during this very, very fascinating and very, very important time of life. So the ways in which the environment and parents and caregivers and whatnot respond to children really is a formative time of life for development later on. So first off, let's talk a little bit about the ongoing brain development that's going on, a little factoids for you. Here is a 3-year-old, and when a person reaches the age of 3, about 75% of their entire brain development has happened. In just 2 years, a 5-year-old brings it up to 90% of brain development. Now, this brain development is the continued synaptogenesis, the branching out of the nervous system, myelination, all of these things working in cooperation with an environment that is engaging, entertaining, all of those things, so that there's a reciprocal relationship between environmental factors and the continued development of the nervous system. Now, primarily, what we see is a lot of development in the areas of the left hemisphere, language development, and the right hemisphere, spatial skills. Of course, that's what we see. This is what we see these kids doing from age 3 to 5. This is the bursting of language and the bursting of their motor skills and understanding how the world works and whatnot. Okay, now, here is a chart. This sort of goes over the kind of gross and motor skills that develop during early childhood. We go from a little bit into the toddler all the way up to 6-year-olds here, and you see the gross motor skills and the fine motor skills. And remember, these are sort of estimates. It's really not useful for parents or anybody to really kind of get freaked out because their kid is behind or ahead. The important thing is the sequence. The sequence, as you can probably imagine in this example, continues to follow the cephalocaudal, proximal distal directions of development. And we'll see, if we look on fine motor skills, you see at 2 to 3-year-olds, they can use large zippers and they can use a spoon, but it takes all the way till they're 5 or 6 to learn the specific motions that would require a knife, to use a knife, how to tie their shoes, how to copy numbers and single words and whatnot when they're writing. You can see how that's moves from larger muscle groups, more of the arm and hand doing the large zippers, to the actual fingertips and their dexterity in the later examples of fine motor skills. But nonetheless, we start to see this sort of development of the physical areas of the children, and also in terms of understanding the world, like you see the 3 to 4-year-olds jumping and hopping, understanding gravity a little bit, understanding their motion of their entire body, throws and catches with a slight upper body movement, more upper arm and whatnot. They can pedal and steer a bicycle. They're starting to really understand not only their body, but their body in relation to the environment around it. So that's an important quality to understand in terms of their development that way. Okay, we're next going to look at cognitive development. Now, cognitive development, of course, we bring back up Jean Piaget, and we're moving into the next stage. We still have the developing concept of schemas, and I'm going to add to that operations, because we're going to see the word operational kind of happen here as we look, essentially, I'll break the news, pre-operational stage. So we have to talk about what operations are before we say that they're missing. Now, operations are the ability to take those internal representations that have been developing throughout the sensory motor and will continue to develop throughout our lives and manipulate them, work with them, kind of engaging the short-term memory or working memory about any sort of object or concept or whatnot that the individual is thinking about. Now, in pre-operational, there's very, very distinct limits. Now, pre-operational doesn't mean that throughout this stage they can never work on these internal representations. It means that it's limited and that over time in experiencing the world, again, that interaction between environment and the developing mind, they begin to be able to manipulate those things, and they start to see the connections between things and the aha moments. And this is why it's so interesting to work with this particular population, why we have a whole population of students here at KV that want to work with this population, enjoy being with children, is because they're constantly having these aha moments of everyday things. You've seen it. Their first sort of experience of gravity, or their experience how sand will go through their arms and just through their fingers, and just everything is just a joyous experience of the physical realities of the world, things that we've come to take for granted, but they're discovering them in a new and cognitive way, and they're making these connections as they develop into what will be the next stage of concrete operations. In the pre-operational area, we'll see that these skills are developing. So as we look here at this particular stage that Piaget has given us, we're really talking a lot about these operations and the developing complexity of schemas. This is pre-operational, and there exists a cognitive egocentrism. This is going to be distinct from the two other areas that we hear of egocentrism. We're going to look at adolescent egocentrism when we get there. And of course, there's the pejorative term of someone's egocentric, somebody's full of themselves. And we'll explore that when we look at midlife. Not that that's the only time of life that can appear, but that's a place where we kind of address some of those issues in this class. But cognitive egocentrism is not a egocentrism that's they're full of themselves. It's the limit of their ability to internalize and perform operations on concepts. It really is that kind of limitation of their cognitive abilities at this stage. So just as when Piaget was first introduced to the world of psychology through his work with Binet, although I don't think that's the first time that he was ever exposed to psychology, but he noticed the typical mistakes that children made when he was doing the statistics on Binet's test. Equally, we can see the mistakes that small children make in pre-operational that indicate to us, they're still in pre-operational because they're not able to do this particular thing yet. And so that cognitive egocentrism expresses itself in a concept of conservation. The full title of this is actually conservation of matter. And what this means is that a young child, a child who's in pre-operational, will perceive when something changes its shape. Let's say a ball of clay becomes a really long snake of clay. We understand as operational thinkers that we can then reverse that. And we can take that long snake and we can pull it back and make a ball out of it and go back and forth. So that ability to reverse actions in the physical world tell us that essentially the quality of the clay has not changed. It's still the same amount of clay, it's just spread out in a different way. A child in pre-operational thinking will not be able to come to that conclusion. They'll look at the small ball of clay, they'll look at the long string of clay, and they'll say, that one's more. Because there's a dimension of it that's been changed. And that the specific cognitive quality that we're talking about there is called centrism, meaning the child focuses on one characteristic as opposed to multiplicity of characteristics that have changed in the visual representation of that object, and therefore they make their judgment based on that one characteristic. It got longer, so it must be more. They didn't recognize longer and thinner. The same thing. And probably the classic example that's used in conservation is the beakers of water. You take 2 beakers of water. There's a little film about this in the course book, and they have the same amount. You take the 1 beaker and you pour it into a tall, thin Erlenmeyer flask, and it goes higher, and the children who are pre-operation will say, oh, now there's more. Usually. That doesn't mean all the time. That's just one of the ways in which pre-operational thinkers differ from what we're going to learn about when we talk about concrete operational thinkers, that inability to reverse and the concept of centrism. I'm only going to focus on one characteristic. It got taller. I'm going to ignore the fact that it got thinner. So it can really only conceive of one of those changes at a time. So conservation. Symbolic functioning starts, I'm reading the next slide. Egocentrism, the idea that I'm seeing things from my point of view, and you must see those things the same way. Now that idea of I think the way I see things is the way that everybody sees things, that is the characteristics of the nasty egocentrism that we experience later in life. But here we have the developmental perspective, right? Someone acts like their understanding of the world is the way everybody understands the world, and we have to say, at what age? And if we say 3 to 5, we're like, oh, that's fine. But if we say 35, well, at 35, you probably should be over that. So, in the egocentrism point of view, and often this is the example you'll see, grandma calls her granddaughter. And granddaughter got a brand new pair of shoes. So she's on the phone. Now this, of course, is different now because we have video phones, so it's even really hard to measure this now. I'll get to that in just a second. But let's say you're on a regular phone, on the audio phone, and the grandmother says, what did you do today? And she says, oh, Grandma, look at my new shoes. And she looks down at her shoes and totally assumes that because she can see the shoes, so can Grandma. So that's an error in cognition that we call egocentrism, that says my point of view must be the point of view that everybody else has. So that's what we see in egocentrism. And we'll look at that when we look at the theory of mind. Now, which is going to come up a little later today. Now, I said the thing about cell phones. Now, it's interesting because the notion of even special effects, or the movies that people are the kind of things that we can see in movies, the fact that a person can see the individual on the screen. This is new, and it's adding an interesting factor to the cognitive development of young children. Now, my own nieces and my granddaughters, we've FaceTimed them on our phones, and I think earlier than in the past, there's this notion of this is an image of someone who's far away, who's not there. It's not like at the beginning, very early on, I actually observed my nieces looking to the back of the camera to see if their father was still there, because that's who we were FaceTiming with. They don't do that, and they quickly did not adopt that. They quickly accepted that the image was right there and that they could talk in real time. And I think this is some interesting development in terms of early childhood cognitive development, the impact of communication technology that really forces the issue of, yes, this is a real-time call, yes, Grandma can see her shoes, just point the camera, and that sense that they're still far away, they're still not right present in the room. This is new stuff, relatively speaking, to the kind of work that's been done to determine what we know right now. So a pretty interesting time to be studying cognitive development in early childhood. So that's egocentrism. We also see a bursting of language, the symbolic functions within our brain, these internalizing of these concepts. I mean, the schemas are racking up hundreds a week, hundreds of new schemas, each new word, each new concept, each new experience. These are just just racking them up, building the information very concretely so that individuals can now communicate. And this is, of course, extremely rewarding. So even if you took this behavioral model, you would say, wow, understanding the word cookie works a lot better than and letting mom guess. So the effectiveness of language is experienced very early in life, and children are highly motivated to get into speaking language. And then the final piece that comes out of Piaget's work is this concept of animism. Now, animism is probably most simply described as the attribution of living characteristics to inanimate objects. And for this age, we can think about the stuffed animals that they have or the dolls that they play with. That they'll attribute feelings to those. So if the doll falls off the couch, let's say, even if they pushed it, that's my granddaughter, pushes Barbie off the couch, Barbie gets hurt. She has pain, she has feelings associated. They attribute those feelings to those inanimate objects. Now this whole concept is extremely interesting about the development of a theory of biology, which I don't really cover in the book. There's theories of physics, theories of biology. All of these are developed. Remember, Piaget really thought that this age was about the child becoming a little scientist. So they're experiencing the world, they're doing these things, and they're developing a sense of physics in the world, as they learn about objects through sensory motor, but then now they're having, what objects do what, and experimenting with them and working with them and looking at their properties. At the same time, we also have them experimenting with biology. So, for example, one of the concepts that develops during this time that is that if an inanimate object is injured, it won't heal itself. It will have to be fixed. Now, somewhere along in the experiential, a child bumped their arm or got a cut, and then they experienced it healing. And they then internalize the notion that biological entities, living entities, fix themselves. Inanimate objects need to be fixed, and if you don't take action, they will remain broken. And this is an interesting concept that develops as they experience both inanimate and animate objects, that then turns into way more advanced schemas that are generalized to living objects versus non-living objects. So very, very interesting concept here. Now, at the same time, this is when explorers went out, particularly, these days we go out and we experience individuals who, in a spiritual way, attribute living characteristics to objects that don't necessarily have normal living characteristics, like the spirit of a rock or a mountain or something like that, that often comes across to us as being somewhat immature. Those concepts, those spiritual concepts, those particular animistic qualities of them are slightly different than the ones that we see here. They are, cognitively speaking, more immature. But in a spiritual realm, they can coexist with much more advanced cognition, while at the same time attributing spiritual qualities to things like mountains, rocks, trees, and whatnot. Trees being living, of course, but those kinds of objects. It's so interesting philosophy to think about how we develop this notion about what's alive, what's not alive, what happens when they get injured, what needs to be fixed, what can be fixed, what dies, what doesn't die, all of these things. And these are some of the fascinating things that are being learned about during this really, really cool age. Now, switching gears a little bit, we look at information processing. Now, this is another way of looking at cognitive development. We've been spending some time with Piaget. I mentioned about information processing being much more quantitative versus Piaget's qualitative changes across the time. And for this particular episode, for this particular segment of this episode, we're going to invite in our friend R2D2 to help us. They're one of the best known robot computers in the world. And R2 says information processing is all about quantity, about processing information. It's very much like a computer where human beings are using the analogy of a computer to understand human cognition. Now, one of the areas that we look at first, changing over time, is a child's ability to pay attention. They're actually to focus on an object, keep their focus on it, exclude other objects that are coming into their sensory world. And this, of course, is very important in terms of learning, as we'll talk about in the next chapter when kids enter schools. And that's kind of when we see, I mean, you might have seen it before, but in school is really where we're going to see if anybody has any issues with attention, they have abnormally low attention, they have attention deficit. We're going to see that manifest most significantly in school when those skills are being demanded upon. Now here we see attention, and we see different kinds of attention. We have how can they divide their attention between two things? How can they select one versus another? And the simple duration, or how long can they sustain attention? And you have a little chart here. It says at 1 year, 3 to 5 minutes attention span, 2 years, 4 to 10, 3, 6 to 15, 4, 8 to 20. You could see all this. Some of you, I know for me, depending on what I'm looking at, the attention span can be pretty low. And so, but we see that this capacity is developing over time. Now, this is not flat out, because just as adults, we know that it kind of depends on what we're looking at. You and I might share a inability to actually read a peer-reviewed article. I'm sure you may have come across those. Of course, I have. And wow, it takes a real effort to sustain attention during that kind of highly technical, highly professional language. Yet, almost all of us can get lost in a novel for hours on end. Or we can watch television for hours on end. Or we can stare at the wall. Either way, those attentions aren't that bad, whereas when something is cognitively taxing, we might get. Now, these are all skills. These are not capacities that people are stuck with. Over the years, I've developed, after having to read a lot of these and understand them, I've developed a higher capacity to endure reading material that is highly technical for a more sustained period of time. So throughout the lifespan, these are changing, but we can see from this chart, there's this immediate sort of like experiential and biological process that's happening, increasing the capacity for children to pay attention. Now, that's not the only information processing aspect that we do look at, and for these processes, we're going to call on R2's best friend, C3PO, is going to be introducing the next concepts here. I was going to attempt the voice, but I won't. You wouldn't have understood me doing R2D2 anyway, been like that, but I won't do. It's a shame to British people for me to try and imitate Anthony Daniels' voice. So here we have information processing looks at the learning process. What happens in the learning process? We're going to be looking at that for the part of our chapter today too. And memory. So we see attention. Attention is one of the most important aspects of memory, and memory is one of the most important aspects of learning. So we see these things. And so in terms of memory, we see changes in sensory memory, and we see changes in working memory. This is short-term memory. So you see the capacity for them to hold things in their short-term memory for long. Now look at the connection here. We have schemas. They can go right through their head, kind of thing. But if we're going to manipulate a schema, if we're going to perform operations on a schema, we have to hold on to it for a little bit. So as we develop the capacity for short-term and working memory, we have the capacity to develop operations. They sort of come in at the same time. Otherwise, we can't move into concrete operational thinking because we have short-term memory deficits or whatever. Most people have no problem with that, and we develop our ability to operate upon the schemas that we have, the internal representations of the world that we have, because we have short-term memory to do it in. So really, really cool stuff. So 3PO continues by talking about executive functioning. Probably one of the most important characteristics of C3PO is ability to imitate the executive functioning of a human being. Now this is the emerging of decision-making, problem-solving, prioritizing, the sense of future. That's not going to come, but it begins. It begins the now, then, stimulus, response, action, reaction. These things start to happen, and they sort of, as we're going to talk about right at the end of today, that happens in the context of play, and that diverse experience, that diverse physical, emotional, social experience is incredibly important for the development of these kinds of skills. And so, again, keeping on the notion of learning, but focusing on a new theory. I'm going to introduce you actually to one of my favorite theorists, and that's Lev Vygotsky, who's a Russian psychologist who, although was a contemporary of Piaget, and they did know of each other's work, because of the Iron Curtain that really restrained communication between the Soviet Union and the West, Vygotsky's work didn't enjoy the same sort of notoriety and popularity of Piaget. And it wasn't until much later that his work came out, when the curtain fell and his work was revealed, and how important, how logical, how very spot on he was about his observations, and the importance not of just, if you think about Piaget's work, the experimenter operates on a feedback system from the objects themselves. They want to, let's say they want to pour water into a container, but it's a sieve. It's like a thing you drain spaghetti in. So they take a glass of water and they pour it through, and it goes right through. And through that feedback mechanism, they learn that these holes let water through. It's part of the quality of that. There's really no need for an individual to be around and say, hey, did you see that? Did you see that the water went through the holes? They don't need that. The experimenter can operate alone. Now, Vygotsky came along and said, that's fine. That all happens. In addition to that, there is a social context in which we learn. And he promoted that idea that in order to encourage learning, understanding the social context in which a person is learning that process is vital to understanding the totality of learning. And so Vygotsky's work gave us terms like scaffolding. You might have even heard this term before, and scaffolding is the concept whereby we organize information and introduce information as teachers or more expert peers, which are teachers, in a way that builds knowledge upon another. So this learning theory had to do with the organization of information. So, for example, in mathematics, we might introduce very simple addition, and then we might move to subtraction with reference back to addition, often, making the relationship between, it's reversible. It's how, you can add something and then take it away. And then we might move into multiplication as a way of expanding addition. And we just keep, and then division being a reversal of multiplication. And we see how one concept builds upon another. And just as we build scaffolds to move up when we're painting a house or building a building, and we build them higher and higher, that's how we build knowledge. Now, this theory, of course, was both descriptive, but it was also prescriptive, meaning he observed teachers naturally doing this, but he also applied this to concepts, when we are structuring learning environments, when we are providing feedback to learners, that we do them in a way that just brings them to that next step. And we'll see how that next step takes into consideration exactly where the person is at and how do we decide what that next step is. That will come up in his concept of zone of proximal development. We'll get to that in just a bit. Before we go there, because this is a social context of learning, I want to introduce you what's called private speech. Now, this is an amazing observation and a great conclusion that Vygotsky came to. And that is when you are in a social learning environment, you rely upon the cues, verbal, nonverbal, otherwise, of people around you to provide feedback as to how you're doing. Think about just in a sport, you go to kick a ball and it goes in the right direction. You have the experience of doing an action and the reaction that you wanted, but you also have the coach saying, good job, that was really great. Keep in mind, focus on when your foot is, put your eye on the ball, make sure that, all of these things. And that feedback mechanism is very important in terms of walking yourself through that process so you can practice it over and over. There's no doubt that we've sat there doing long division and somebody said, carry over, do this, add this, minus this, when we're doing that process. Now, Vygotsky made the observation that social interaction, the speaking and feedback between you as the learner and a more advanced individual who's taking on the role of a teacher is so important in the learning process that in the absence of another person, we'll talk to ourselves through it. This private speech, giving ourselves a vocal feedback mechanism as to what we're doing when we're learning something. Now, this is something that begins during this early childhood phase, and it's out loud, and often, maybe for us too, it's out loud, but this is a lifelong skill that we develop to talk ourselves through a process. Particularly when we're first learning it, many things become automated, but when we're learning something for the first time, we might actually have this internal voice that was actually external before. So he made observations of young children speaking to themselves, and his conclusion, which I believe is correct, was that social interaction is so important in learning that we talk to ourselves in the absence of others. Now, this theory became really, really central to the work that I do, understanding the social nature of online learning, which, due to its nature, has limited vocal, gesture type of communication. All the communication in an online class is mediated through technology, even with Zoom. I had a recent conversation with some folks. I was doing a training on the importance of reflection in their work for some volunteers for the main campus compact. And we talked about, well, there was one individual who talked about how they used tone of voice and body language a lot, and that's missing, that not the entire communication message is coming through on video. So even when you have live chats, it's still not quite the same, at least certainly not for this individual. So how do we mitigate that? How do we address that issue? Here we have Vygotsky way back saying, this is vital. We need to have people around us. There's a totality of communication message, not just the words, not just the tone of voice, all the things, the facial expressions, the actual presence or foreignness, actual closeness of the individual physically, their movements, their arm movements, their hand movements, the slight nodding of their head when you know you're going in the right direction. All of these have become part of our normal learning environments, and in online learning, many of those are absent. So the call to arms here is to figure out how can we have good online learning in the absence of those. So we're going to have to create other ways to do that. And that is challenging. It's a challenging part of making online learning equitable to the best of face-to-face learning. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It just means that we have to really emphasize those things. Otherwise, it's more challenging. We have to work harder to learn, although we still can learn in an online class, than we do when we have access to all of that feedback mechanism that occurs in a face-to-face environment. So, very cool stuff. Now, the last piece that Vygotsky gives us is this concept of zone or proximal development, which I wanted to put third here, although it relates a lot to scaffolding. Now, zone or proximal development is represented by this graphic. Let's take a close look at that. And here we have sort of concentric circles describing the current snapshot of someone's learning and knowledge regarding a subject matter. And what we see are three zones. There's the inside circle, which is the comfort zone. There's the outside circle, which is the anxiety zone. And then there's the middle one, aptly named the zone of proximal development. Now, if we're teaching a subject, now this is probably the most concrete way to explain why we have age grades. So you have first grade, which is 6 years old, second grade, 7 years old, third grade, 8 years old, and we have them as the kids change, as the kids grow older, we have delineations as to what's being taught and how it's being taught. The presumption is that a child is developing normatively along there, so that their capacities are growing. So we don't want to take a 6-year-old and put them among the 8-year-olds unless they're back to IQ, right? When we're thinking about if a child is thinking like an 8-year-old, they probably want to be with 8-year-olds. But here we have, put the 6th graders together because they're right around the same place. This, of course, is not always, it's always challenging. Kids are at different developmental stages, even though they might be the same age. And I will tell you that it's extremely challenging at the college level, where you can have 18-year-olds sitting there with 70-year-olds in the same room. Now, cognitively speaking, we might not have any issues, but there might be other qualities about experiencing a college classroom that make distinctions between the ages sometimes. Okay, but back to early childhood here. We're teaching something, and we recognize that if we take the totality of information that goes from very easy to very hard, and we teach the very, very hard stuff, we might actually be providing information where the individual experiences that's over my head, I can't perform, this is going to be embarrassing if I try to do this, particularly if other people are able to do it in the room. I'm bored, I'm going to act out. I'm putting the act out things in here because I'll get to a point about that. I'm going to act out. Now, if we are too easy, we're teaching things they already know how to do, they're distracted with other things, they're bored, I'm going to act out. Teachers shoot, hopefully, and it's a challenging process, easier to do when it's one-on-one, hence that's why tutoring is sometimes cool. A teacher may present information in a way that sort of covers everybody in the room. I'm going to review, I'm going to challenge, and maybe I'm going to throw a few things in there that only a few people are ready to hear. And there'll be overlap on the next class, and hopefully the class will move along pretty much together from content to content. In a tutoring situation, the tutor's opportunity is to focus right where the person is at. What do you already know? What was too far? Let's get right into that zone of proximal development. And if we can nail that zone of proximal development, we can challenge, they're interested, they're engaged, and potentially when we are focusing our attention on the things that we are just not quite able to understand, but with a little help we will, there's the potential to get into flow, which is that deep engagement into a process, and we can lose ourselves in that. And that's probably considered sort of like almost a peak learning experience is flow. When we're into that process, we're learning, we're engaging, we're exercising our skills, maybe creating something new. I've seen this with some of the folks that Stephen LaRochelle has worked with 3D printing. I've seen it in my own students who are working on projects. I've seen it individuals doing service learning. And it's not even that you need those sort of extra experiences. You can get right in the zone because you're reading something of great interest and it's being presented to you at just the right rate, just the right language. And so it's a pleasurable experience, what makes learning fun. And so Vygotsky gave us this. We have this model now. Now this, I want to throw out there, just like a combination of Piaget's work, which is the experimenter operating on feedback in order to develop cognition, and this idea of way beyond me, too easy, and in the middle, is really you combine those two concepts and what you have is Montessori education. The Montessori education model is based on individuals choosing their activities and engaging them, and the materials are designed to provide feedback. Piaget. The zone of proximal development isn't addressed because given all of the objects in the room and a child is put into a Montessori classroom, they will independently gravitate to things that are beyond easy but not too far. The children will actually, this is the theory, they'll actually be attracted to topics, to interactions, to whatever that are in their zone of proximal development. It's a very, very cool theory. And so, now, speaking of cool theories, one of my favorite theories to talk about is, of course, theory of mind, something that develops right around the age of 3 and continues to develop an incredibly important concept in terms of adult development. And we'll see, again, just like we looked at perspective taking, we have theory of mind. Or the theory of mind is part of perspective taking, just like we looked at cognitive egocentrism, and all those things, understanding how others think. Now, when somebody establishes, when they have developed to the point of theory of mind, a few characteristics can be identified. The individual understands that other people want different things. We're moving away. This is literally a moving away from that cognitive egocentrism. So you're moving from the world is all about me, and what I see is what everybody sees, and then theory of mind is the opposite side of that. And so we have other people desire different things. They have different goals, they want different things than I do. Other people will have different beliefs than I do about what's real, what's not, all of these things. Different people will have access to different knowledge. When you're observing, some people may have access to knowledge, some people may not, and those individuals, therefore, are going to have different beliefs about that situation. We have false beliefs that result from that. If you don't have the knowledge, then you will tend to believe something that's not true. How appropriate is that to be talking about right now? And then we do have emotions that are not apparent, and those may appear indirectly. So it's important here to recognize that these characteristics develop over the time, the ability to recognize that others are separate. Freud called it individuation separation. Right? Separation, individuation, one of those. And it's that, for him it was a emotional, social, psychiatric, the id, ego, and superego, recognizing that others exist and that they're different than you. That separation. We see this coming out in his concept of separation anxiety, all of these things, that when there's a certain amount of like, oh, they're not this, they're different than me, a little unpredictable, maybe. Okay, so let's take a little bit more look at theory of mind. I'll give you an example of this very concrete example. Here we have two individuals. Now they're facing away from each other and they place objects in front of them. On the left side, we have the person looking at a blue triangle. On the right, we expose that person to a red circle. And you can see that the person on the left takes a look at the blue triangle and formulates an internal representation of that blue triangle inside a schema, inside of their mind. Person on the right does the same thing. Now this represents personal internal representation. They're not talking to each other, not saying anything. You have these two people. One of them has an internal representation of what they see. The other one has an internal representation of what they see, and they're different from one another. Now, prior to theory of mind, in this situation, if I asked the person who's being exposed to the blue triangle, what is the other person thinking? What is the other person seeing? They would say, this is prior to theory of mind, they would say they're thinking of a blue triangle because their thinking is egocentric. Their perspective is egocentric. So they would just assume that everybody's looking at the blue triangle. However, after theory of mind, when the person does and is in possession of theory of mind, I would again ask, what do you think that this person, and they would be able to conclude that that individual has a different experience than they do, and they would say they are experiencing a red circle, even though I'm experiencing the blue triangle. And this is a non-egocentric perspective. So, last example here, this is right from the course book. We have Sally and Anne and describe the situation. Now this right here is actually a test for theory of mind. So you can take this image and you can go to a 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4-year-old, and you can test as to whether or not they have theory of mind. Now depending on their answer to the question at the end, it will tell you whether they have theory of mind. So let's review the situation here. You present this to a child and you say, here, Sally and Anne are playing. Sally puts the ball inside the basket and then Sally leaves the room. Sally is no longer aware of what's going on. You're not saying all this, but no, Sally's no longer aware of what's going on. And while she's gone, mean Anne moves the ball into the box. And then Anne leaves the room. When Sally comes back, where is Sally going to look for the ball? That's the question that you pose to the child. You say, where will Sally look for the ball? Now, if the person you're asking does not have theory of mind, they will not be able to distinguish their own knowledge that Anne put the ball in the box from Sally's knowledge that she was out of the room. They would assume everybody, I watched Anne put the ball in the box. Everybody knows that the ball is now in the box. So Sally comes back and Where will Sally look for the ball? And the non-theory of mind child will say they're going to look in the box because everybody knows it's in the box. The child with theory of mind will know that Sally has a different belief system because when she left, the ball was still in the basket. So when she came back, I know it's in the box. You know it's in the box. Me and Ann knows it's in the box. But Sally doesn't know it's in the box. So she's going to look in the basket. So if they say, look in the box, they do not have theory of mind. If they say, look in the basket, they say they have theory of mind. Cool example. Now, let's look a little bit at some of the things that are related to theory of mind. Really, really big concepts. Self-concept. Love the fireworks. Self-esteem is related to this. Self-control. Social roles. And perspective taking. Huge, huge processes that come from theory of mind. You need theory of mind in order for these things to develop throughout the lifespan. That's extremely interesting. A little aside here with persons who are on the spectrum, meaning autism spectrum disorder. One of the characteristics that varies across that spectrum is the degree to which they have theory of mind. Theory of mind is often pinpointed as a diagnostic criteria for a person with autism. Those individuals struggle with the ability to perceive others as having different ideas than them. And of course, along that spectrum, there's people that are very severe to the point of disabling, and then there's individuals that simply struggle with those things, but don't necessarily have the inability to lead a regular, a relatively normal life. People who are on the spectrum that way. Like Elon Musk, apparently, some people are saying he is on the spectrum. And we don't know how much theory of mind he has. So let's take a look at one of the really, really big theories that I get into in this class that's going to be a part of this also is, of course, looking glass self. Now that will come up much later in the class. We'll look at looking glass self, but I will go back at that point and talk about theory of mind and the ability to internalize the perspectives of others being a vital aspect of the development of our self-concept. Now, one of the areas that I explore right at the end, and I explored this with the help of a couple students who were trans, and they helped me write this part of the chapter, and it was a very, very cool experience of collaboration between myself as a teacher who has no lived experience with this kind of process and students who felt that it was important that this concept be accurately portrayed in courses here at KVCC. And we're going to take a look at the concept of gender identity. That's a hot topic going on in the States right now and across the world. And the notion of there being only two genders is on the table. Now, I want to be clear that this does not necessarily represent that there biologically there's pretty much just two. There's males and females, or women and men, or whatever term that you want to talk about. What we're really talking about is the social construct of a person's gender. Gender is a socially determined topic. It does relate to biology because we assume those correlations. We assume that if an individual has the body characteristics of a male, that the socially defined characteristics of maleness that are present in a society must exist in that person. And we often associate those. So we may, let's say, for example, there's an individual who has a female biological body, but yet identifies with characteristics that are usually associated with male characteristics. They'll call them male characteristics. They won't say, oh, that's just a version of women characteristics. It's that distinction between socially defined characteristics remains. And so individuals, for example, who look at themselves and say the the personality characteristics of myself do not match what society says are the characteristics that would match with my biology, so I identify with the other biology more, or a mix, any sort of mix. That's why I kind of put this graphic. This graphic isn't a joke per se, but it's how diverse this can be, how individuals can share characteristics. And I guess fundamentally for me, in our society, sadly, I think, has a blue box and a pink box. And in the blue box, we put the expectations that we have for people with male bodies. And in the pink box, put the expectations that we have for people with female bodies. And sadly, we kind of draw a hard line, and it's hard for some individuals to get characteristics from the other box. This is sort of foolish when you think about it, and it really, really fundamentally, except for the very extremes, it fundamentally gets in the way of everybody, because there are characteristics that I enjoy about myself that are from the pink box, and there are characteristics that I enjoy about myself from the blue box, and I really don't care which box they came out of. So ultimately, I see the issue as one in which there are limits imposed by the social constructs of gender, and at this point, it's important to point those out, and that individuals will truly feel and truly identify and need to communicate to others and be acknowledged as having a set of characteristics that are not necessarily from the box associated with their biology. And we respect that. To the point of using different pronouns, to the point of doing, ultimately, I think, hopefully society is going to change and some of this stuff really won't matter someday. I mean, I guess that's the dream that we would all want. We would not want to pigeonhole people for any reason. Same as race, same as age, same as all the other ways in which we discriminate and pigeonhole people. But nonetheless, that's our current situation. Now, at the same time, as a psychologist, I recognize that there is the presence of issues such as gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia. Now, these are diagnoses, but they're not the same thing as someone being trans, although they may, or trans or non-binary or one of the other characteristics here. Gender dysphoria is a sense of discomfort, emotional anxiety about one's body not matching their identity. That can be extremely frustrating, extremely anxiety-provoking, to the point of it exists within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. That piece requires treatment. It requires to be addressed. For someone who has gender dysphoria, then they're seeing, well, which one did I say first? Either one, they both. Okay, let me get this straight. Gender dysphoria, my identity, my blue box and pink box selections are, I'll say selections and endowment, because, some of this is biologically connected and kind of hardwired. So we don't match society, and that is causing problems, and I'm anxious about it, and I'm depressed, and all that stuff. We need to address that. Body dysmorphia, I hate my body because it doesn't match my perspective. We recognize these as kind of the extreme, just like any other behavior. A person can be trans and feel good about that, and a person can be along the way, or they can be in circumstances where they're feeling extreme anxiety about it. Where it gets a little wonky is oftentimes the extreme anxiety about it is not necessarily just internal, but it's because they're being fought by their environment. The environment is resisting that individual's desire to express themselves the way they want to. And that's where that anxiety comes from. So the treatment, the approach that a psychologist could have to this would be, one, validating, of course, where the person is at. That's what we do. And then, well, if there is a presence a gender dysphoria, where is that coming from? Is it coming internally from yourself and your frustration with this? Address it that way. If it's coming externally, we address it that way. And the different approaches to that particular sense of anxiety and distress, which is real. And of course, body dysmorphia, it's actually, there's a range of that that's not just gender oriented, but we'll focus on the gender ones here. When an individual is born without the body that they truly identify with, I think it's important at some level for people to understand and learn how to appreciate the bodies that they do have, particularly in really young ages, where body identity can become such an important issue, particularly as they enter into adolescence and going through those changes, that, yeah, to a degree, we're stuck with what we've got. And it's important, I believe, to teach to love that body, to take care of that body, even though it's not the ideal body that you have. But these are extreme emotions that people have, and I believe they do need to be addressed in counseling and therapy. Now, not every person who's trans has gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia. That is, again, those are legitimate issues that come up, and they need to be dealt with in terms just of any other anxiety disorder that's going on. And so the real trick sometimes it's because of the social rejection of that, and so it becomes not only a psychological issue for the individual who's going through this, but it also becomes a social issue. And so our interventions are both psychological and in terms of advocacy for the acceptance of different points of view. So hope I was able to present that pretty well. It's not the easiest concept to talk about when you don't have personal experience with it. So the last kind of concepts we're going to be going through here is an exploration quickly of Erikson's stages here. And we have been through infancy, trust and mistrust, and we spent a little bit of time in early childhood, the autonomy versus shame and doubt, and certainly the terrible twos. And now we're moving on into preschool, and the concept is initiative versus guilt. Now, I'm going to tell you, terrifying threes. These are, parents will tell you the twos were bad, but the threes were really bad. These are the kids that are going to get it into their heads that they're going to go and cook you breakfast, and they have enough physical movement and ability to go downstairs, put the toaster on and all that stuff while you're in bed. And I don't know, all the things that can happen from that. They're taking initiative, and how we respond to that. They're coming up with ideas on things to do. They really want to be a part of the decision making in the house. They want to take those leading roles and being a member of the household. And it's very important for us to be able to embrace those and, of course, do them safely. Now, look, the other side of that is guilt, that the individual can result in a sense of guilt related to this. And that individual would then be very reluctant to take initiative to change things to how they would like to see them happen. And of course, you could probably see, we're going to look at these first three stages here, trust, autonomy, and initiative, and how important they are in later life. So that's Erikson for right now. So initiative. Now the next one is going to be a doozy. The next one we're going to go into school age, and we're going to look at industry, where kids are learning what they're good at, what they're not good at, and essentially it's in relation to other people. So that social circle of comparison explodes out as they become compared to their same-aged peers. Now in this next topic, I want to talk about play, types of play, and I'm going to refer back to that important part of physical development and language development and whatnot. And we see that this is the place where this is all happening. This is the canvas upon which children are painting their cognitive and social and emotional and language development. And they can engage in a number of different kinds of play that entail a number of different developmental capacities that are going. So here we have the child in unoccupied play, essentially not doing really anything, just imagining, just looking, spacing out. That doesn't mean that they're not, I said, no, I guess I made an error. It's not that they're not doing anything. They might be doing amazing things in their head. They're just processing in their head and they're just looking. They're fine. Then we have over here, this little boy is engaging in solitary play. Obviously, they're working with objects, they're playing a scene, they're moving things around, but they're doing so alone. And here's this other child over here looking at them, watching them do it. We also see parallel play where you have two individuals doing the same thing, but there's no interaction between them. And then we have associative play where there's a bit of interaction, maybe sharing of materials. Can I borrow your red crayon, or something like that. And finally, we see cooperative play, and something I'll be getting into in the next chapter, which is the notion of games. Because cooperative play entails a degree of the setting of the stage. And the setting of the stage, kind of talk about that in terms of cognitive development. We talk about the understanding of rules, about limiting your behavior to a set of rules. In fact, the joy of gaming is that you are confined to rules and that you have to act within those rules. You can't just do anything. We call that cheating. But the cognitive ability to be able to actually abide by those rules is something that's developing. And certainly I know that, I played Candyland with my two daughters who are of different ages, and I played with them at that time when one of them was able to understand the game rules and the other one was not. And the kind of chaos that could erupt when Hannah would get into the lead, and Mara, being very smart, knew that she needed 2 purple squares to get ahead of Hannah. So rather than take the next card, which is in the rules, takes the whole pack and starts looking for the two purple squares. She starts to cheat, and that drives Hannah crazy because it's not fun. She's operating on the, rules make it fun kind of thing. Rules make it fair. All that stuff. Now, with all that, okay, we have this difference in terms of what's okay to do and understanding in terms of cooperative play, games, and games with rules. We're really starting to edge on to the stages of moral development and what's the right thing to do, which we'll be getting into in a few chapters. That this kind of, they all lead to each other. So we have, theory of mind, then we have games and role playing, cooperative play, and then there's right and wrong. There's cheating versus following the rules, and we start to see this important development of skills all happening in this play environment that we have. In addition, right from the first slide, look at what's going on. We have hemispherical, left hemispherical development, language development, right hemisphere spatial skills going on all over this slide right now. So right from the beginning, we see this play environment as being the critical environment in which all of these things are actually happening. And that brings us to the end of chapter 4, an exhaustive but extremely cool part of the class. So for our assessments, we had chapter 4 discussion, simply reflecting on what you have learned from the materials that I've included in the course book, and do some additional research. What have you learned that you did not know? If you yourself are trans or non-binary, you're free to share or not share your story. You're free to act as if this is all new. There's no pressure on you to reveal yourself or out yourself in this class. I believe it should be a safe place for you to do and talk about your personal experiences, but you're certainly not required to do that. But introducing some other materials that you might be aware of or that you come across, as the corp applies to everybody. If you can come across some information that helps us to understand the different life experience of somebody else. This is an exercise in perspective taking. So I'm not asking necessarily for your own personal thoughts. I'm asked, did you find anything surprising? Did you find anything that maybe countered your own beliefs? How do you, and without necessarily needing to express those beliefs per se, but to think about, am I surprised by some things, or did I not know something? Do I have some prejudices, maybe, that I need to deal with? And it's certainly okay to discuss those. Now we move into a quiz on theory of mind. Now this is a critical thinking quiz here, and this is, I present to you another scenario, not the box and ball one. Be very mindful. There's another scenario involving Sally, the same Sally from the box and ball. But Sally's at home with her dog Fido. And the story is in your course book. And so make sure that you read that story, and then I declare that Sally has theory of mind based on the information that is in that story, and only the information in that story gives me ample evidence that she has theory of mind, and I need you to explain to me why Dr. Kavanaugh thinks Sally has theory of mind. That's all I'm asking you to do. Now, we look at the first, I believe, assignment relating to your subject for your biography. And for this, we're going to look at Erikson's first 3 stages. And I got into that a little bit right at the end, the importance of those 3 stages. We have trust, autonomy, and initiative. And we see that trusting others, being able to operate on our own and do things on our own, and taking initiative in our life are characteristics that are lifelong. I'm asking you to talk to your subject about these 3 characteristics that they have. It's probably unlikely that they'll be able to tell you stories from early on, at least not stories that they remember themselves. They might remember stories that have been told to them, or some people do have some very early memories. But that doesn't limit you from being able to look at their life today and conjecture. How was their trust, autonomy, and initiative based on the person that they became? These are very formative building blocks of our psychosocial development. So a lack of trust, or a lack of autonomy, or a lack of initiative may very well represent itself later on. Now, the quandary about this whole assignment is that many individuals who have had rotten early lives, let's say an individual who not trusted, didn't trust the world, no autonomy, not a lot of initiative, probably will not be willing to participate to being your subject. So usually we have some pretty good connection there. But what I'm looking for is there any evidence in their life story that tells you that they probably had good or bad experiences during these early stages in life? And of course, any stories that they might have that are directly relevant to that, let's say they were put up for adoption, or they were, that may have challenged those things. You can include those, of course, anything that might have happened during those parts of their lives. But then how did that result long term? We're sort of kind of looking for that connection between early development and functioning later on. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. Lots of stuff in this age group. Very, very fun group to study. Lots of building blocks to what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the class. So I hope this was enjoyable, and I will see you in the discussion boards. So have a great week.